My sister-in-law wants my house and demanded that I sign away any inheritance rights since I wasn't real family anymore after my husband died. She lost everything instead. My sister-in-law Natalie started her campaign to push me out of the family exactly 1 week after my husband Ben died in a car accident. She showed up at my door while I was still in shock and said, "We need to discuss your living situation now that you're not technically family anymore." I was too grief-stricken to even process what she was saying, but she kept going, explaining that the house Ben and I bought together was really family property since Ben's parents had given us money for the down payment 5 years ago. She graciously offered to let me stay for another month to find somewhere else to live. When I didn't respond, she patted my shoulder and said, "I know this is hard, but Ben would want his assets to stay in the real family." Over the next few weeks, Natalie escalated her attempts to claim everything Ben and I had built together. She'd call daily with helpful suggestions about which items I should leave behind when I moved out. The furniture Ben's grandmother gave us obviously stays with the bloodline. The photo albums from family vacations belong to us since you're just in them by circumstance. Even Ben's personal belongings like his watch collection and his grandfather's war medals needed to return to their rightful owners, meaning her. She started telling other family members that I was being difficult about the transition and refusing to accept that my connection to them died with Ben. She'd host family dinners and deliberately not invite me, then post pictures with captions about the real Harrisons sticking together through tough times. When Ben's parents asked where I was, she'd say I was choosing to isolate myself because I couldn't accept reality. She convinced Ben's younger brother that I was probably going to sell everything and disappear with the money, so he started texting me, asking when I'd return his brother's belongings. The situation got worse when Ben's father Walter passed away from a heart attack 3 months after Ben died. Walter had been devastated by Ben's death, and his health rapidly declined. At the funeral, Natalie pulled me aside and said, "Now that Walter's gone, there's really no reason for you to keep hanging around, is there?" She actually tried to have me removed from the family section at the service, saying those seats were for immediate family only. Ben's mother Dorothy was too distraught to notice what was happening, and Natalie used that to her advantage. She became Dorothy's self-appointed caretaker and gatekeeper, controlling who could visit and when. Suddenly, I needed Natalie's permission to see my mother-in-law, who I'd been close to for 7 years. Natalie would schedule my visits for inconvenient times, then cancel last minute saying Dorothy wasn't feeling up to visitors. She'd tell Dorothy I was too busy to come see her, then tell me Dorothy didn't want to see me. The inheritance issue exploded 6 months after Ben's death, when Dorothy announced she was updating her will. She wanted to make sure Ben's portion would still go to me since Ben and I had been trying to have children, and she wanted to honor what would have been his wishes. Natalie completely lost her mind. She called an emergency family meeting without inviting me, then showed up at my door with Ben's brother and 3 cousins to stage what she called an intervention. She stood in my living room and announced that I needed to sign paperwork declining any inheritance from the Harrison family since I was no longer a Harrison and never really had been. She'd actually brought documents she'd had drafted by some sketchy paralegal friend. She said Ben's portion should be divided between the real children and that my presence in the will was an insult to Ben's memory. She went on this rant about how I was a gold digger who trapped Ben with marriage and now wanted to profit from his death and his father's death. She said I should be ashamed of myself for manipulating a grieving old woman and stealing from Ben's actual family. Ben's brother Kyle started to look uncomfortable and said maybe we should discuss this later, but Natalie shut him down, saying this needed to be handled before I sunk my claws in any deeper. That's when Dorothy walked through my front door with her key. She'd been sitting in the car the whole time listening through the doorbell camera app on her phone. Natalie tried to spin it saying she was protecting Dorothy's interests, but Dorothy cut her off. "Actually, Natalie, since we're discussing inheritance, let's talk about the $50,000 you stole from Walter's business account while he was in the hospital." Natalie went pale and started stammering. Dorothy held up her phone and showed everyone the screen with my doorbell camera app still running. She'd been listening to everything from her car parked down the street. Natalie stepped backward toward my front door, and her face went from pale to bright red. Kyle looked between his mother and his sister-in-law with total confusion written all over his face. The 3 cousins shifted their weight and glanced at each other like they wanted to disappear into the walls. Dorothy walked further into my living room and stood right in front of Natalie, blocking her path to the door. She explained that she got worried when Natalie kept canceling my visits and controlling who could see her. She'd asked me 3 weeks ago to keep my doorbell camera active and share access with her phone. She wanted to know what Natalie was really saying when she thought no one was listening. Dorothy said she'd been monitoring the app whenever Natalie came to my house, and today she heard the whole intervention speech. Natalie opened her mouth and started talking fast about how Dorothy must have misunderstood what she heard. She said Dorothy was confused from grief and not thinking clearly about the money situation. She tried to put her hand on Dorothy's arm, but Dorothy pulled away and reached into her purse. She pulled out a stack of papers that looked like bank statements. The papers were folded and had sticky notes marking certain pages. Dorothy unfolded them and held them up so everyone could see the highlighted lines. She pointed to transfers from Walter's business account to an account with Natalie's name on it. The dates on the transfers were all from when Walter was in the hospital dying. Dorothy's voice stayed calm, but her hands shook while she held the papers. She said the bank manager had called her last week asking about unusual account activity. That's when she discovered $50,000 missing from Walter's business account. Kyle moved closer and asked to see the statements. Dorothy handed them over and Kyle started reading through each page. His face changed as he read the highlighted sections. His mouth got tight and his eyes went hard. He looked up at Natalie and asked how she could steal from their dying father. His voice cracked when he said the word father. Natalie started talking louder, saying she didn't steal anything and she had permission to access the account. She said Walter told her she could use the money if she needed it. Kyle shook his head and said their father was barely conscious in the hospital during those dates. He said there was no way Walter gave permission for anything. The three cousins moved toward the door without saying a word. They looked embarrassed and angry about being dragged into this situation. One of them muttered something about not knowing what this was really about. They walked out and I heard their car start up in my driveway. Natalie tried to follow them, but Dorothy stepped in front of the doorway. Dorothy told her she wasn't going anywhere until the police arrived. Natalie's eyes went wide and she said Dorothy couldn't be serious about calling the police over a family matter. I pulled out my phone and dialed while Dorothy kept herself between Natalie and the door. Natalie started crying and saying she only took the money because she needed it for her kids. She said her family was struggling and Walter would have wanted to help them anyway. Dorothy didn't move from the doorway. She just stood there watching Natalie switch between crying and making excuses. Natalie said the medical bills were piling up and her husband didn't make enough money. She said she was going to pay it back eventually. I gave the dispatcher my address and explained that we needed an officer for a theft investigation. Dorothy sat down on my couch, still holding the bank statements. Natalie paced around my living room, wiping her eyes and talking about how hard things had been for her family. She kept saying Walter would understand if he was still alive. A police car pulled up in front of my house 20 minutes later. A detective in plain clothes got out and walked to my door. He introduced himself as Detective Mateo Santos and asked what was going on. Dorothy handed him the bank statements and explained about the missing $50,000 from her late husband's business account. The detective looked through the papers while Dorothy pointed out the transfers and dates. He asked Natalie to explain why her name was on the receiving account. Natalie's story started changing as she talked. First, she said Walter gave her access to help with business expenses. Then she said she thought the account was a family emergency fund. Then she said she only borrowed the money temporarily. Detective Santos wrote everything down and asked more questions about when Walter died and who had legal access to his accounts. Natalie couldn't keep her answers straight. The detective asked her to come to the station for formal questioning. Natalie looked at Dorothy and asked if she was really going to let them arrest her. Dorothy said she wasn't getting arrested yet, but she needed to answer questions about where the money went. The detective walked Natalie out to his car and told her she wasn't under arrest, but needed to give a formal statement. I watched through my front window as they drove away. An hour later, someone knocked on my door. I looked through the peephole and saw Clifford standing there. He looked terrible with red eyes and messy hair. I opened the door and he asked if he could come in. He said the police had just called him and told him his wife was investigated for stealing from Walter. He sat down on my couch and put his head in his hands. He said he had no idea Natalie had done anything like this. He thought the money for their new furniture and car came from an inheritance from her parents who died 2 years ago. Dorothy came back from the kitchen with water and sat down across from Clifford. He looked up at her and said he was so sorry. He said he never would have let Natalie take money from Walter, especially while he was dying in the hospital. He asked Dorothy what was going to happen now. Dorothy said that depended on what the police found in their investigation. Clifford said he'd been noticing Natalie acting strange for months, but he thought it was stress from Walter and Ben dying. He said she'd been spending a lot and making big purchases without talking to him first. Dorothy's face softened a little when she looked at Clifford. She said she knew he wasn't part of this. The room got quiet except for the sound of Clifford crying. After a while, Dorothy asked if I would stay with her for a few days. She said she didn't want to be alone in the house she'd shared with Walter. I told her, of course, and went upstairs to pack a bag. I threw some clothes and toiletries into an overnight bag while my mind tried to process everything that had happened. Dorothy said goodbye to Clifford, and we drove to her house together. We sat in her kitchen that night drinking tea and talking about Ben and Walter. Dorothy said she couldn't believe Natalie had stolen from Walter while he was dying. She said it felt like another death on top of losing her husband and son. I held her hand across the table and we both cried. She said she was glad I was there because I was the only one who really understood what she'd lost. We stayed up late looking through old photo albums and sharing memories. Dorothy kept saying how much Ben had loved me and how proud he would be that I stood up to Natalie. She said I was her daughter no matter what anyone else tried to claim. That night, I slept in Ben's old childhood bedroom surrounded by his high school trophies and pictures. It hurt to be there, but it also felt right to be close to his memory while everything else was falling apart. The next morning, I woke up in Ben's old bedroom feeling disoriented until I remembered where I was and why. I could hear Dorothy moving around downstairs in the kitchen making coffee. I got dressed and went down to find her sitting at the table staring at her phone. She looked up when I came in and said Kyle texted that he wanted to come over and talk to both of us. He showed up 20 minutes later looking like he hadn't slept much either. So Kyle sat down at the kitchen table and put his hands flat on the surface like he was trying to steady himself. He looked at me and said he was sorry for believing everything Natalie told him about me. He said she'd always been good at twisting things to make herself look right, but he never imagined she'd steal from their dying father or try to push me out of the family. Dorothy reached over and squeezed his hand, while I sat there not sure what to say. Kyle said he felt like an idiot for texting me all those demands about returning Ben's belongings when Natalie was the one stealing from everyone. He said he should have known better because Ben had loved me so much and would never have wanted his family treating me this way. We sat there for a while drinking coffee and talking about what would happen next with Natalie and the police investigation. Dorothy said she needed to get a real lawyer involved to handle everything properly. She pulled out her phone and started searching for family attorneys in the area. Kyle suggested someone he knew from work, but Dorothy said she wanted someone who specialized in elder abuse cases and estate planning. She made several calls that morning while Kyle and I cleaned up the kitchen and tried to act normal. By noon, Dorothy had scheduled a meeting with Bethany Archer for that afternoon. We all drove to Bethany's office together and sat in the waiting room until she called us back. Bethany was probably in her 50s with gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take everything in at once. She listened to Dorothy explain the whole situation about Natalie stealing the money and trying to force me out of the family. Bethany took notes and asked specific questions about the bank transfers and the fake inheritance documents. She said from what Dorothy was describing, Natalie had committed multiple felonies, including embezzlement and elder financial abuse. She explained that elder financial abuse was a serious crime because Walter had been vulnerable while dying in the hospital. Bethany said she'd need to review all the financial records and coordinate with the detective handling the criminal case. Dorothy signed papers hiring Bethany to represent her interests and make sure the will was protected from any challenges Natalie might try to make. Over the next week, Bethany worked fast going through every document she could get her hands on. She called Dorothy one afternoon and asked us to come to her office right away. When we got there, Bethany had papers spread across her conference table. She pointed to several documents and said Natalie had forged Walter's signature on business papers to give herself access to accounts. Bethany had compared the signatures to Walter's real signature on other documents, and they didn't match. She said the forgery added more criminal charges, and proved this wasn't just an impulsive decision Natalie made in a moment of weakness. This was planned and deliberate, which would make the charges more serious. Dorothy sat down hard in one of the conference room chairs and asked how Natalie could have done this to Walter. Bethany said people who commit financial elder abuse often plan it carefully and take advantage of their victims' trust. She said she was sending all the evidence to Detective Santos and recommending additional charges. That same week, Clifford called Dorothy and asked if he could come talk to her. He showed up at her house looking even worse than before with bags under his eyes. He told Dorothy he'd filed for divorce from Natalie and moved out of their house. He said he couldn't stay married to someone who would steal from a dying man and try to destroy his family. Clifford said he was getting full custody of the kids because Natalie's legal problems made her an unfit parent. He brought his 2 teenagers with him to see Dorothy, and they both apologized for their mother's behavior. The kids seemed genuinely upset and confused about what their mom had done. Dorothy hugged them and said they weren't responsible for Natalie's choices. She told them they were always welcome in her home no matter what happened with their mother. Clifford thanked Dorothy for not blaming his children and said he'd make sure they stayed connected to the Harrison family. A few days later, Detective Santos called to update us on the investigation. He said they'd questioned the paralegal who drafted the fake inheritance documents for Natalie. The paralegal admitted Natalie had paid her $500 cash to create the papers. She said Natalie told her it was just to scare me into leaving, and she didn't realize it was part of a bigger scheme to steal from the family. The paralegal was cooperating fully with the investigation to avoid getting charged herself. Detective Santos said the paralegal's testimony would help prove Natalie had planned to force me out, so she could take everything. Meanwhile, Bethany finished updating Dorothy's will with ironclad language protecting my inheritance. She made it crystal clear that I would receive Ben's full portion exactly as he would have wanted. Bethany added specific provisions preventing Natalie from contesting the will or receiving anything from the estate. She said even if Natalie tried to challenge it after Dorothy died, the language was strong enough to shut down any claims. Dorothy signed the new will with me and Kyle as witnesses. Bethany made copies of everything and stored the original in her office safe. 2 weeks after the confrontation at my house, Detective Santos called to say Natalie was being formally charged with embezzlement, elder financial abuse, and forgery. He said her bail was set high because the judge considered her a flight risk given the amount of money involved and how much she'd lied to everyone. Natalie's lawyer tried to argue for lower bail, but the prosecutor presented evidence of her deceptive behavior, and the judge wasn't sympathetic. Dorothy didn't go to the bail hearing, but Detective Santos sent her updates about what happened. After everything settled down a bit, Dorothy asked if I wanted to start going through Ben's belongings. I'd been avoiding his things because it hurt too much to face them, but I knew I needed to do it eventually. We started in the storage room where I'd boxed up his clothes and personal items after he died. Dorothy helped me sort through everything, and we shared memories about Ben as we touched his things. She insisted I keep everything because Ben would want me to have his belongings, not his sister. We spent hours going through boxes, and Dorothy told me stories about Ben as a kid that I'd never heard before. Kyle came over one afternoon to help us organize Ben's watch collection. Ben had inherited several watches from his grandfather, and collected others over the years. Kyle carefully laid them out on the dining room table, and we looked at each one. That's when Kyle picked up his grandfather's old pocket watch and noticed something inside the case. He opened it and found a folded piece of paper tucked into the back. Kyle pulled it out, and his hands started shaking as he read the first line. He looked at me and said it was a letter from Ben. I took the paper from Kyle and recognized Ben's handwriting immediately. The letter was dated 2 weeks before he died. Ben had written about how much he loved me and how lucky he felt to have me as his wife. He wrote about his hopes for our future children and the life we'd build together. He said if anything ever happened to him, he wanted me to know I'd made him happier than he ever thought possible. Reading Ben's words broke something open inside me that I'd been holding tight since he died. I sat at the table crying while holding the letter, and Dorothy came over and wrapped her arms around me. She held me while I sobbed and said I was the best thing that ever happened to her son. Kyle sat across from us with tears running down his face. Dorothy said Ben would be so proud of how I stood up to Natalie and fought for my place in the family. She said I honored his memory by refusing to let anyone erase me or pretend our marriage didn't matter. A few days later, Penelope called Dorothy with news about the accounting review. She found more problems in Walter's business records going back almost 2 years before he got sick. Natalie had been taking smaller amounts for a long time and hiding it really well. The total wasn't $50,000 like we thought. It was closer to $75,000. Penelope showed us printed statements with highlighted sections where money got moved around. Each transfer looked normal by itself, but when you put them all together, the pattern was clear. Natalie had been stealing from her own father for years. Dorothy sat at her kitchen table staring at the papers, and I watched her hands shake. She kept saying she should have noticed something was wrong, but Natalie handled so much of the business paperwork that Walter trusted her completely. The bigger theft amount changed everything with the criminal case. Bethany explained that $75,000 meant Natalie faced more serious felony charges instead of just the lower-level ones. The prosecutor could push for actual prison time now instead of probation. Natalie's lawyer tried to set up a meeting about a plea deal, but the prosecutor's office sent back a message saying they weren't interested in being easy on her. The elder abuse part made it worse because Natalie stole from her dying father while he was in the hospital. Bethany said judges really hate that kind of thing, and Natalie was going to have a hard time in court. 2 weeks after everything happened, Dorothy got a phone call from Natalie's oldest daughter, asking if she could still visit her grandmother. Dorothy started crying on the phone, and told her of course she could come over anytime. The girl said her younger brother wanted to come too. Dorothy made it really clear to both kids that she didn't blame them for anything their mom did. She told them they were still her grandchildren and she loved them no matter what. The kids came over that Saturday, and Dorothy made cookies with them like she used to do before all this started. I stopped by while they were there and the kids looked scared at first, but Dorothy kept everything normal and happy. She showed them old photo albums and talked about when their dad and Ben were little. The kids relaxed after a while and it felt good to see Dorothy smile again. I went back to work the following Monday after being on bereavement leave for so long. My boss had been really understanding about everything and told me to take whatever time I needed. Walking into the office felt strange after being away dealing with grief and family drama for months. My coworkers were all supportive and didn't push me to talk about what happened. A few people brought me coffee or left cards on my desk. It felt good to have normal routines again. Sitting at my computer and working on regular projects gave me something to focus on besides Ben's death and Natalie's betrayal. I could just be a person doing a job instead of a grieving widow fighting for her place in a family. Clifford called me a few days later and asked if he could bring the kids over to my house. He said they wanted to apologize for their mom's behavior, and he thought it would be good for them to talk to me directly. I agreed, even though I felt nervous about it. The kids showed up with Clifford and both of them looked miserable. The oldest one started talking first and said she was really sorry about what her mom did. She said they had no idea their mom was stealing money or trying to push me out of the family. Her brother nodded and said their mom told them I was the one causing problems. They believed her because she's their mom. I told them I understood and I didn't blame them for anything. Clifford looked relieved and thanked me for being kind to his kids. He said he was trying to help them process everything that happened and figure out how to move forward. Dorothy started going to grief counseling around the same time to deal with losing Walter and Ben so close together. She asked me if I would come to some of the sessions with her because we were both grieving the same people. I said yes because I thought it might help both of us. The counselor was a nice woman who let us talk about our memories and our pain without trying to rush us through it. Dorothy talked about how much she missed Walter and how guilty she felt for not seeing what Natalie was doing. I talked about missing Ben and feeling lost without him. We cried together during the sessions, and it helped to share that grief with someone who understood. The counselor gave us tools for dealing with hard days and helped us see that healing doesn't mean forgetting the people we lost. Detective Santos called Dorothy a few weeks later with an update about Natalie's case. He said they found out Natalie tried to hide some of the stolen money in offshore bank accounts. She thought she could keep it away from the investigation, but they tracked it down and froze everything. Natalie wouldn't be able to touch any of the stolen money. All of it would get returned to Walter's estate once the legal stuff got finished. Dorothy asked how Natalie even knew how to set up offshore accounts, and Detective Santos said she probably got help from someone, but they were still looking into that part. He said the important thing was that Natalie couldn't benefit from what she stole, and the money would come back to the family where it belonged. 3 months after the big confrontation at my house, Natalie's trial date finally got set on the court calendar. Bethany called to tell us the date and explain what would probably happen. She said given all the evidence against Natalie, there was a good chance Natalie would plead guilty instead of going to trial. A trial meant everything would come out in public, and Natalie would probably get a longer sentence if the jury convicted her. Pleading guilty might get her a shorter sentence, but she'd still go to prison. Bethany said the prosecutor had a really strong case with all the bank records and Penelope's accounting work. She didn't think Natalie's lawyer could win at trial, so a plea deal made more sense. Dorothy asked if we'd have to testify, and Bethany said probably not if Natalie pleaded guilty. That was a relief because Dorothy didn't want to sit in court and talk about everything that happened. Kyle started coming over to Dorothy's house more often to help her with things around the property. We'd end up talking while doing yard work or fixing stuff in the house. One afternoon, we were cleaning out the garage and Kyle stopped and looked at me. He said I was his sister no matter what happened to Ben. He said Natalie never understood what family really means. Family isn't just about blood. It's about showing up for people and caring about them even when things get hard. I started crying and Kyle gave me a hug. He said Ben would be happy that we were all sticking together. We spent the rest of the afternoon going through boxes and sharing stories about Ben. It felt good to have Kyle as my brother instead of someone Natalie turned against me. Dorothy decided she wanted to host Thanksgiving at her house that year. She invited me and Kyle and Clifford and Natalie's kids. She said it would be sad without Ben and Walter, but being together as a real family would help us all heal. Thanksgiving Day came and we all showed up at Dorothy's house. The kids helped Dorothy cook while Kyle and I set the table. Clifford brought wine and dessert. We sat down together and Dorothy said a prayer thanking God for family and for getting through hard times. Everyone held hands around the table. It was sad looking at the empty chairs where Ben and Walter should have been sitting, but it also felt right to be together. We ate and talked and the kids told funny stories about school. Dorothy smiled more than I'd seen her smile in months. After dinner, we all helped clean up and then sat in the living room looking at old family photos. Kyle put his arm around my shoulders and I leaned against him. This was my family. Not because of blood or marriage papers, but because we chose each other. That's what mattered. 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, Bethany called Dorothy to say Natalie's lawyer wanted to talk about a plea deal. She explained that Natalie would admit to all the charges in exchange for the prosecutor recommending 4 years in prison, plus paying back the full $75,000 with interest. Bethany said this was actually a decent offer, considering Natalie could get up to 10 years if she went to trial and lost. Dorothy asked me and Kyle to come over that evening, so we could talk about whether to accept it. We sat in Dorothy's kitchen drinking coffee while Bethany went through all the options. If we pushed for trial, it would take months and everything would become public record. Natalie's kids would have to hear all the details in court. The media might pick up the story since it involved elder abuse and embezzlement. Dorothy looked tired just thinking about it. Kyle said he wanted Natalie to pay for what she did, but he also didn't want to drag his niece and nephew through a public trial. I agreed that the kids had already been through enough. Dorothy sat quietly for a long time before she said she'd accept the plea deal. She told Bethany to let the prosecutor know. Bethany made the call right there and everything got set in motion. The plea hearing got scheduled for 3 weeks later at the county courthouse. Dorothy asked if we had to go, and Bethany said it would be good for the judge to see the family there, but we didn't have to testify or say anything. The morning of the hearing, we all met in the courthouse lobby. Clifford showed up with his lawyer looking nervous. He nodded at us, but didn't come over to talk. We went through security and found the right courtroom. It was smaller than I expected, with wooden benches and fluorescent lights that made everything look washed out. Natalie came in wearing an orange jumpsuit with her hands cuffed in front of her. She looked thinner and older than the last time I'd seen her. Her lawyer stood next to her while the judge read through all the charges. The judge asked Natalie if she understood what she was pleading guilty to, and Natalie said yes in a quiet voice. Then the judge made her go through each charge one by one and admit what she did. Natalie had to say out loud that she stole money from Walter's business account while he was dying in the hospital. She had to admit she forged his signature on documents. She had to say she took $75,000 total over 2 years. Her voice shook, but she got through it all. At the end, she said she was sorry, and that she knew what she did was wrong. The judge stared at her for a long moment before saying that stealing from a dying family member was one of the most despicable things he'd seen in his courtroom. He said Natalie had betrayed her family's trust during their darkest time and deserved serious consequences. Then he accepted the plea agreement and set the sentencing hearing for 2 weeks later. We all stood up and filed out of the courtroom. Dorothy didn't look at Natalie. Kyle kept his arm around Dorothy's shoulders as we walked to the parking lot. The sentencing hearing was shorter. The judge sentenced Natalie to 4 years in state prison with possibility of parole after 2 years if she showed real change. She also had to pay back every dollar plus interest and all the court costs. The bailiff led her away, and that was it. Outside the courthouse, Clifford came over to Dorothy. He thanked her for not pushing for the maximum sentence. He said he knew his kids needed their grandmother in their lives, and he appreciated Dorothy showing mercy. Dorothy told him she did it because Walter would have wanted compassion even for someone who hurt him so badly. Clifford's eyes got wet, and he hugged Dorothy before walking away. 6 months had passed since Ben died. I still missed him every day, but the sharp edge of grief had dulled into something I could carry. Dorothy suggested I might want to try dating again. She said Ben would want me to be happy and find love again instead of spending my whole life alone. The idea scared me, but it also felt right somehow. I joined a dating app and started talking to a few people. Most of the conversations went nowhere, but then I matched with someone who seemed genuine and kind. We met for coffee and talked for 3 hours. He knew Ben had died and didn't try to rush me or make me forget. We started seeing each other regularly. Dorothy smiled when I told her about him and said she was glad I was opening my heart again. Kyle started dating someone too. He brought her to family dinner one Sunday and she seemed sweet and a little nervous. Dorothy welcomed her warmly and asked about her job and her family. I watched Kyle hold his girlfriend's hand under the table and felt happy that he was building his own life. The dinner felt good even with the empty chairs where Ben and Walter should have been sitting. We were healing slowly, and finding ways to move forward together. Dorothy made a big decision that fall. She sold Walter's business to a company that had been trying to buy it for years. She used some of the money to set up college funds for Natalie's kids. She said they shouldn't suffer because their mother made terrible choices. Walter would have wanted to help his grandchildren even if he couldn't stand what Natalie did. Clifford cried when Dorothy told him about the college funds. I finally felt ready to finish going through Ben's things. I'd been avoiding it because it hurt too much, but now it felt like something I needed to do. Dorothy helped me sort through boxes of his clothes and books and random stuff he'd collected over the years. We kept his watch collection and his grandfather's war medals and the letter he wrote me. I found his favorite hoodie that still smelled like him and his college yearbook with silly notes from his friends. I put everything meaningful into a wooden box and stored it in my closet. It felt like I was honoring Ben's memory while also accepting that I needed to keep living. Dorothy hugged me and said Ben would be proud of how strong I'd become. Clifford's divorce from Natalie became final in December. The judge gave him full custody of the kids with supervised visits for Natalie once she got out of prison. Clifford brought the kids to Dorothy's house for Christmas, and we all tried to make it as normal as possible. The kids seemed happier now that the legal stuff was over and they knew where they stood. Dorothy gave them presents and made their favorite foods. Kyle brought his girlfriend and I brought my boyfriend. We took pictures together and sang carols and tried to create new traditions that honored Ben and Walter while also moving forward. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was ours. Spring came and Dorothy called to ask if I would help her create a memorial garden for Ben and Walter in her backyard. She wanted a place where she could sit and remember them without feeling sad all the time. I drove over the next Saturday with gardening gloves, and we spent the morning planning where everything would go. Dorothy wanted roses because Walter always bought her roses on their anniversary. She wanted the bench Ben built in high school woodshop placed in the center. We worked every weekend for a month digging beds and laying stones and planting flowers. Kyle came over some Saturdays to help move heavy rocks and build a small fountain. The garden became this peaceful spot where we could talk about Ben and Walter without crying every time. Dorothy would make lemonade and we'd sit on Ben's bench and share stories I'd never heard before. One afternoon while we were planting tulip bulbs, my boyfriend showed up with sandwiches for lunch. He'd been coming around more and Dorothy liked him because he asked questions about Ben and didn't act weird about me being a widow. After Dorothy went inside to get drinks, he sat next to me on the bench and said he needed to tell me something. He looked nervous and kept pulling at the grass. He said he knew this was complicated and he understood I still loved Ben, but he was falling in love with me. My heart started racing and I felt scared and excited at the same time. I told him I was scared too, but I wanted to try. He kissed me and it felt different from kissing Ben, but also right in its own way. Dorothy came back outside and saw us holding hands, and she smiled this huge smile that made her whole face light up. A few weeks later, Kyle brought his girlfriend to family dinner, and halfway through dessert, he got down on one knee and proposed. His girlfriend started crying happy tears and said yes, and we all hugged them. Kyle pulled me aside after and asked if I would help with the wedding planning because his girlfriend didn't have much family, and they wanted me involved in everything. Being asked to help plan a happy event instead of dealing with funerals and court cases felt amazing. I went dress shopping with Kyle's fiancé and helped pick flowers and tasted about 50 different cake samples. Dorothy threw herself into planning mode and it gave her something joyful to focus on. She decided to update her will again and called Bethany to come over. Dorothy told Bethany she wanted to include Kyle's fiancé and my boyfriend in the will. She said family wasn't about blood. It was about who showed up and loved you when things got hard. Bethany drafted everything and Dorothy signed it in front of witnesses. She made copies for everyone and told us she wanted us to know we were all equally her family now. About a month later, Bethany called and said Natalie had written letters from prison to Dorothy and me. Dorothy asked Bethany to bring hers over. I went with Dorothy when she read it. Natalie's letter talked about being sorry and how prison gave her time to think about what she'd done. She said she knew she couldn't undo the damage, but she wanted us to know she regretted everything. Dorothy folded the letter and put it in a drawer. She said she believed Natalie was sorry, but sorry didn't fix what got broken. When Bethany asked if I wanted my letter, I told her to hold it unopened. I wasn't ready to hear anything Natalie had to say. Maybe someday, but not now. My boyfriend and I started talking seriously about our future. We'd been dating for almost 8 months and things felt solid between us. One night we were watching a movie at my house and he paused it and said he wanted to talk about where this was going. He said he could see a future with me, but he needed to know I was ready for that. I told him I would always love Ben, and I would always miss him, but there was room in my heart for new love too. He said that was all he needed to hear. We talked about maybe moving in together after Kyle's wedding and what that would look like. It felt good to plan a future instead of just surviving each day. Kyle's wedding happened on a beautiful Saturday in October. The ceremony was outside in a park with trees turning orange and red. Dorothy cried happy tears during the vows and squeezed my hand. Kyle and his new wife looked so happy standing up there promising to love each other. At the reception, Dorothy gave a toast about how proud Walter and Ben would be to see Kyle starting this new chapter. She looked right at me when she said that Ben would be so glad to see the family healing and moving forward together. I cried, but they were good tears this time. Kyle and his wife had their first dance, and then Kyle danced with Dorothy and his wife danced with her dad. My boyfriend and I danced too, and he whispered that maybe we'd have our own wedding someday. The whole day felt like proof that good things could still happen even after terrible loss. A year had passed since the confrontation in my living room when Dorothy revealed what Natalie had done. I was in a genuinely good place now. My boyfriend and I had moved in together and were talking about getting engaged. I had a strong bond with Dorothy and Kyle that felt unbreakable. I'd processed my grief for Ben in healthy ways with help from a counselor. I still missed Ben every single day, but the pain didn't knock me down anymore. I could remember the good times without falling apart. I could look at our wedding photos and smile instead of just crying. Dorothy and I were having coffee in her kitchen one morning, and she said she wanted to tell me something important. She said that standing up to Natalie and fighting for my place in the family was the best thing I could have done. She said I honored Ben's memory by refusing to let Natalie erase me from the family. She said Ben loved me so much, and he would be proud of the strong person I'd become. She thanked me for not giving up on her or the family even when Natalie made everything so hard. I hugged her and told her she was the one who saved me by believing in me and standing up for me. We sat there crying happy tears and looking at the memorial garden through the kitchen window. My boyfriend and I started seriously planning our future together. We talked about maybe buying a house with a bigger yard. We talked about having kids someday and how we'd make sure they knew about Ben and Walter. We talked about staying close with Dorothy and Kyle and building a life that honored the past while moving forward. Dorothy invited us over for Sunday dinners every week, and it became our routine. Kyle and his wife came too, and we'd all cook together and share stories. Life had thrown terrible things at me with Ben dying, and then Walter dying, and then Natalie's betrayal on top of all that grief. But I survived it. I found my strength when I had to fight for my place in the family. I built something good from all that pain. I had love again with my boyfriend. I had family with Dorothy and Kyle. I had peace with Ben's memory instead of just endless sadness. I knew Ben would be proud of who I'd become and how I'd refused to let tragedy define my whole life. I was planning a future instead of just surviving, and that felt like the best way to honor everything Ben and I had together.